on, friends? My name is Gary, and this is my channel, Weakest of Weeks. I appreciate you clicking on the video, and definitely consider subscribing. I have a ton of how-to stuff out there, and I would appreciate the sub. So today, we are working on my 2008 Laser Red Saab 9.3 Aero front-wheel drive, and we are replacing the wheel bearings. Now, there's a couple different symptoms you may have when diagnosing a wheel bearing. A couple quick symptoms. You can wiggle the wheel up and down, or even side to side. And if you hear a noise like that, more than likely it's the wheel bearing. But first, check to make sure the lug nuts are tight. That's going to be the easiest thing and the simplest resolution. But if your lug nuts are in fact tight and you have that noise, then your wheel bearing is bad, or there's other suspension components that may be bad. So if you're diagnosing the front, if you wiggle it side to side like this, you may have a bad tie rod end, things like that. But if it's on the back side of it, if you have any sort of play whatsoever, more than likely that rear wheel bearing is bad. And also, if you're driving and you hear kind of a howling and it increases as the speed increases, almost kind of like a propeller on a prop plane, more than likely the wheel bearing is bad as well. This will work on any 2003 to 2011, 2012 Saab 9.3, the sport sedan 4-door, the convertible 2-door, as well as the 5-door sport combi wagon. So let's go ahead and get started. Here are the wheel bearings that I'll be using in this specific install. I decided to go with a Moog brand, which is in fact an aftermarket brand, but I find it to be a fantastic alternative to the original equipment. Now, the original equipment, I don't know specifically what the brand is. At one point on eSaabParts.com, I saw FAG being the brand, which is an absolute unfortunate name by any means, but that was very expensive, and you're looking at $291 for a replacement bearing versus the Moog, which was tremendously cheaper at a fraction of the cost. Part number 512307 I got from Amazon, which I'll link in the description, but 2-day shipping and a fraction of the cost versus the original equipment. So the Moog brand I've used for a number of years, whether it be suspension or wheel bearing parts. They're a fantastic alternative that I believe will last the remainder of the life of the car, and they have an excellent warranty. So here's what they look like. Nothing too spectacular. Looks like additional wheel bearing. If yours is the cross-wheel drive, you will have a hole here with splines. That way the CV axle goes through it, and there'll be the additional spindle nut on the end that you'll need to remove. But otherwise, the installation and removal process is very similar, regardless of front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. Obviously, the spindle will go through here. But I will link the cross-wheel drive version in the description as well. Fun fact, the cross-wheel drive, the rear wheel bearing is the same as the front wheel bearing. So conveniently enough, the cross-wheel drives take all four of the same wheel bearings, but the front wheel drives do not. The rears are specific, the fronts are specific. So now that we know what bearings we'll be installing, let's move on to the disassembly. My 17mm deep well, got my Ryobi impact, I'm ready to knock off these lugs. With the wheel and tire off here, you can see the rotor, the caliper bracket, and then ever so slightly, this is just the wheel bearing poking out. So obviously all this stuff is rusty, a lot of it's surface rust. Believe it or not, this rotor is actually in pretty good shape, but this is what happens when you live in a rust belt state. Unfortunately, things get a little rusty and crusty. So what we'll start with is removal of this brake caliper, and how we'll do that is by knocking off these little caps here. There's 2 of them. You just pop off like that, one right there, one at the bottom, and then that'll expose 2 Allen bolts, and then we'll be able to kind of finagle this off, but we'll also need to take this metal bracket off. Get some pliers, take note of where the metal tab here is in relation to the actual bracket. It goes underneath. If you don't place this back into place right when you reassemble it, your pads will not wear properly. Unfortunately, this side of the brake bracket is stuck, so I'm going to get a little PB blaster. I feel like this is probably going to be a common theme for My disassembly here is using some penetrating oil, but we'll let that soak. We'll try to wiggle this out, and I have replacement ones of these, so I'm not too worried about it. I just don't want it breaking off in the caliper. Well, that's not good. With the two little plastic caps off, now get a 7mm Allen key socket. Doesn't have to be this long, but go ahead and use something like this. If you use a traditional Allen key, you may not be able to get enough torque on it and you're gonna bust up your hand. So get something like this. Spring goes on the inside closest to the caliper piston. T30 if you still have the set screw still in its place. In case you're wondering how exactly I got that stuck piece broken off inside the caliper from that bracket, well, here's the method I devised. Fortunately, there's holes that go through. So this was the one that was perfectly fine, and then this is the one that was stuck. So that clip goes on that side. So basically I spun this over, set a block of wood in between here and here, grabbed a pick tool, found that hole, at least the back side of it, right there, sprayed some PB Blast in there, and whacked it multiple times with a hammer, and 20 minutes later, that little broken piece came out. Current situation, the E20 Torx bolts that secure the brake bracket on here, the caliper bracket, those are frozen. The bottom one I got loose, top one not so much. So now what I'm resorting to is an E20. If you're not familiar with that is, that's what that is on the top here, the breaker bar, and then a 21mm impact socket, and I'm trying to remove this bolt up top here. E20 E-Torx, I already have these somewhat loose. That's the bolt I knocked through to get a better angle at this bolt. Now you can use a 12-point 14mm wrench like this, but with that bolt in there, I wasn't able to get enough leverage. So because I'm fighting a stuck bracket bolt, I'm gonna take off this rear sway bar link. So if you must take this off, it's either a E14 external Torx or even a 11mm 12-point, which that's what I've been using, just mainly because there's not a lot of space right here. It's a long bolt. Made some progress, got this bracket off. I mean, once you get these two bolts out, you're able to just get this out. Well, mine was rather stuck and rusted in there. Now I'm on the point where the rotor should come off, but another complication, mine has this ring on it, and most people will not have this little ring on here. It should look just like this, nice and smooth. Well, my vehicle has aftermarket wheels on it that aren't the 65.1mm size, and unfortunately it requires a ring, so you can see how large the center is. And if you're to just take this hub, you notice there's a lot of slop. So unfortunately that hole is too big to go on here, which then therefore requires a little hub-centric ring like such. I believe this is just like a plastic of some sort, like a nylon. But unfortunately now when it's time to take the rotor off, we're running into a snag here because this is all scaled with rust. So we'll have to get a block of wood behind here, kind of rotate the rotor and smack a little bit and work this ring off. There you go. Ring is removed. Here's the back side of the hub bearing and the 4 bolts that need removed. I'm using a 5/8 impact socket, a shallow one. So I'm not sure what that translates into metric, but it just so happened that I had the 5/8 handy and that's what worked. So confusing part is this electrical connector. Most electrical connectors, you just push down on this tab and it releases. This is a little bit different. There is actually a blue tab to the side. Get your screwdriver in here and twist it so you can see it release that a little bit. So push down on the tab and pull back and it releases. So definitely remove this clip before you try to get any sockets on here. That way you don't risk breaking the connector that goes into here. Got the big guy right here. I'll smack around here, and before I do that, I'm actually going to spray some PB Blaster around this thing, let it soak in, and then hit it with a hammer. There it is. Here's the back side, and this little lip right here goes inside. It's knuckle recessed, and that's why these things get so fused, because it just, everything rusts together and it's such high tolerance. This thing never wants to come out. So I definitely need to clean this up, get my dust shield off here. It's not in the best shape, but it's actually pretty solid. It is rusted away in this little corner here, but I'm not too worried about that. Everything else is pretty solid. Here's the old one. Now, I'm not sure that this is original. It says SKF. Let me know down in the comments if this is original. And if you can listen closely, it's definitely not quiet. And here's the new one. Definitely harder to turn. There's more resistance to it. It's a lot quieter. This makes noise and it's kind of wobbly. So, well worth the replacement. It is now the next day and I knocked a ton of rust off this knuckle as well as other close by suspension components. Now I use some of this POR Paint Over Rust 15, just their traditional black, and you can get it in clear and some other stuff. And actually this part right here is still a little bit wet. I actually did another coat on that and a couple other touch-up areas. And then I decided to spray paint the caliper, which I used this Duplicolor ceramic paint, the bright red, which I think matches perfectly with the laser red. So now we're on to the reassembly phase. Notice how I didn't paint this section right here. That is where the dust shield rests, and I also cleaned this with a Scotch-Brite both surfaces, just so that this is exactly how the tolerances were whenever I disassembled it, and then I just knocked off the surface rust. You build a bunch of paint on here, and that can affect how this hub bolts onto here, so it's best to just kind of keep this as is, clean it, and now we're good for reassembly. So if you notice on the hub, there is 4 bolts, but the top 2 are actually spaced a little bit farther apart than the bottom 2, so this will only go one way, and same thing goes for both sides. The same bearing is used on the left and the right. So we have the dust shield. We'll take the hub, place it through like that, and we can line it up, make sure everything's good. Looks good, and we'll actually back this out. That way we can apply a little bit of anti-seize to this. So because I want this to be serviceable, in case I ever need to go in here, God forbid there's an issue, I need to pull this one out, I'm using a bit of Permatex anti-seize just as extra insurance to make sure the new hub's not going to rust in this. Here's the back side of the hub, and we're now ready to tighten these 5/8, or I found out it's actually a 16mm nut on the back side of here, And you can tell I covered this also with the Pour 15, and I tried to avoid the bolts just mainly because you definitely don't want it on the threads, because once you try to back this out, that'll definitely give you resistance, as well as the heads of these. You don't want to cake it with it, and especially on these e-torque style, because any additional crap on here is going to make it that much more difficult to get the socket on there properly. So let's finger tighten these, get them all started before we bust out the ratchet and tighten these down. All 4 bolts are attached. If you're wondering as far as torque specs, it's 40 foot-pounds plus 30 degrees. And now we're ready for the electrical connector. Pops on, reverse order how we took it off. So clip it in there and then push over this little blue tab. Give it a good wiggle, that's in place, and we're good. We're now ready to refasten this rear sway bar end link. So I have a jack underneath holding this hub up. We'll finger tighten this, and then we'll crank it down with either an E14, or I'll likely start this with an 11mm 12-point wrench. It's also a good idea to apply a little bit of anti-seize on this hub so the back side of the rotor does not get stuck. If you ever want to service your rotor again in a rust belt state, it's definitely a good idea to apply some anti-seize. Now grab your T30 lockout screw, tighten this down, and this only gets torqued down to 5 pound-feet. Next up is the brake caliper bracket, and it takes these 2 bigger bolts. They're either an E20 E-Torx bolt or a 14mm 12-point you can use. We'll go ahead and start to finger tighten these on here. Caliper bracket bolts are now fixed in place. Torques down to 96 pound-feet plus 45 degrees. Now we can hang the caliper onto the bracket. Time to replace the pads. Not 100% required, but definitely take a look at the life of your pads. Mine were actually in decent shape, but I figured I'm in here, I might as well replace them. The rotor is actually in really great shape, but the pads were definitely showing some wear. So this is the part number that I'm using. This is by Wherever. I got it at my local Advanced Auto Parts. That's the part number right there. They are ceramic. That's what the original equipment would have been. Also comes with the hardware. We have one with a spring, one without. The side with the spring goes on the inside closest to the caliper piston, and we will take a little bit of brake grease and put it on some of the contact points. So just a little bit on the ears here, as well as the back side, like such. Now ready to drape the caliper onto the bracket. And an important thing to mention is that if you are replacing the pads, more than likely you will need to twist in this piston. You cannot use a traditional C-clamp. You'll need to use a tool like this, which you can purchase, or just go to your local auto parts store, and more than likely you can rent a full-on kit that has everything you need to twist in the piston. Onto the 2 slider pins. Take a little brake grease and apply it to the smooth portion of it. And I feel like this goes without saying, but definitely don't apply any of the grease to the threads. If you do decide to apply anything to the threads, I would recommend a little bit of blue Loctite, but don't go crazy. And certainly do not use the red permanent stuff. So we'll put these 2 in place, one at the top, one at the bottom, and torque it down to 21 pound-feet. Ready to reapply these plastic push pins that clip on over top of those slider pins we just installed. Now, the new hardware kit with the brake pads did not come with these, so make sure you save the old ones. Clip reinstallation process now, and because The other one broke off one of these nubs inside that caliper. I am now going to be applying a little bit of anti-seize to the ends, something that I've never done before. I didn't think it was needed, but after breaking one of these off inside that caliper, I definitely don't want to do that again. Make sure the ears of the clip go underneath this caliper bracket. Yours probably will not have this just because I have the aftermarket wheels, but I will slide this little ring back on. Definitely do not forget about this top suspension bolt if you backed it out. It definitely helps to get at that top brake caliper bolt, but it's already in place. Just need to knock it through the rest of the way. Tighten this down to 92 pound-feet of torque plus 135 degrees. E20 E-Torx and a 21 millimeter nut. I definitely say reattach this bolt and torque it down before you attach the caliper. I did it a little bit differently. I did it a little bit late, but it's not the end of the world. You can get a wrench inside here, the 21 millimeter, and tighten the E20 external Torx down and still get your torque wrench in here. But it's best to kind of save a little bit of room and actually get your torque wrench on the nut side of it. It's the home stretch, but before you call this job complete, ensure all your bolts are in place, torque to spec. Make sure your brake caliper clip is properly oriented. Not a bad idea to spray one last go around with brake clean. Make sure the rotor is as clean as possible. Also, go inside the vehicle, pump the brakes a couple times, make sure that piston that you pushed in if you replace the pads goes back right where it needs to go, and not a bad idea to pull the e-brake to make sure that is functioning properly. Fast forward through time, and this driver's side is complete as well. I've just gone through the checks, make sure everything is torqued to spec. E-brake cable is in place, unlike that last clip on the passenger side it wasn't, and I went a step further and replaced those rear lower bushings that go to the knuckle. The old ones I pressed out and replaced them with some pretty cool upgraded ones. So click up top there. I did a video about that as well. But going back to the wheel bearings, these are what came out of the vehicle. They are SKF brand, both of them are, and I believe these are original, but I would actually like to know, so comment down below if SKF is the original equipment manufacturer of the wheel bearings on these Saabs. So that pretty much does it on the rear wheel bearing installation on your Saab 9.3. I have one step left, kind of a boring one, just taking this last wheel and tire, throwing it on the vehicle, dropping it down, and torquing the lugs to spec. So if this video helped you out, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Also, consider subscribing. I have a ton of Saab videos out there, and I would appreciate the sub. One last thing before I go, all these parts I installed in this video, I will link in the description, so check that out. But with that being said, I appreciate you watching, and I'll catch your friends next time.